marry the first man who enters," she joked. Then the Korean Mafia boss walked in. Min Jae-yoon did not believe in fate. She believed in spreadsheets, contingency plans, and the kind of quiet competence that keeps a person invisible long enough to survive. What she did not believe in was doors, specifically, the ones you open by mistake that change the entire geometry of your life and cannot, under any circumstances, be unopened. She thought it was a storage room. It was the beginning of everything. Like and subscribe before Chapter 2 drops, because this story doesn't slow down, doesn't soften, and doesn't let anyone off easy. Share it with someone who needs a story that keeps them up at night. The client disappeared on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not with a phone call that crackled with tension, or a meeting that ended badly, or any of the narrative architecture that disappearances usually required in films and television, which Min Jae had watched enough of to know that real life rarely bothered with production value. Oswoo simply stopped answering. His phone rang out. His office number redirected to a recorded message about business hours that nobody was keeping. His assistant, a young man who had always seemed faintly apologetic about his employer's existence, sent a single text that said Mr. Oswoo is currently unavailable and then became unavailable himself. Tuesday became Wednesday. Wednesday became a problem. Min Jae sat at her desk, which was also her kitchen table, which was also her filing system, her thinking space, and the primary location of every crisis she had managed alone in the 3 years since she had started Uniteriors, with a business plan, a second-hand laptop, and the specific optimism of someone who had not yet been fully educated by experience, and looked at the numbers. The numbers were not good. She had commissioned 40% of the restaurant renovation already. Contractors paid. Materials ordered. Structural work begun on the false wall paneling that the client had insisted upon for what he called aesthetic flow, and what Min Jae had privately considered structurally unnecessary but professionally executed without comment because the client was paying and the client's money had been reliable. The client's money was now theoretical. She had, in her account, enough to cover her own rent and approximately 2 months of operational costs if she stopped eating anything that required cooking. The invoices outstanding totaled a number she had written down and then turned the paper face down because looking at it repeatedly served no productive function. She made a list. This was what she did with problems, not because lists solved them but because the act of writing them down converted panic into inventory, and inventory could be managed even when panic could not. Options: 1. Contact Oswoo again. 2. Legal action. Timeline too slow. 3. Personal loan from whom? 4. Negotiate extensions with contractors. 5. Speak to restaurant owner directly. She looked at the list, added a 6th item, stared at it, crossed it out, added it again. 6. Ask someone for help. She crossed it out again. The restaurant owner was a man named Baek-soo, who had leased his space to Oswoo for the renovation period and had, on the 2 occasions Min Jae had interacted with him, the distracted energy of someone managing too many things to be fully present in any of them. He was not, she suspected, the decision-maker. The building had the particular quality of spaces that belong to people who are never seen in them, maintained too precisely, too quietly, with the kind of institutional calm that comes from consistent management rather than personal attention. She called his number at 8:30 in the evening. He answered on the 4th ring, sounding surprised to be called, which surprised her in return because she had left 3 messages over 2 days and had assumed he was avoiding her. He wasn't avoiding her. He simply hadn't received the messages, which meant someone else was managing his communications, which meant the building was exactly what she had suspected, a property with an owner several layers above the man whose name was on the lease. "Come to the restaurant," Baek-soo said. "Tonight. I'll be there until 10. She went. The restaurant at 9 in the evening was halfway between its former self and its future one. Walls half-stripped, new paneling in stacks along one side, the bones of something good visible beneath the disruption of renovation. Min Jae walked through it with the particular eye of someone who had spent 3 years learning to see spaces as they would be rather than as they were, and felt the familiar quiet satisfaction of a project taking shape, followed immediately by the hollow awareness that this project might not be hers to finish. Baek-soo was in the front room, phone to his ear, and held up a finger when she entered 1 minute. She waited. He talked for 4 minutes about something that had nothing to do with her, and she used the time to review the space, to mentally rewalk the decisions she had made, to locate the false wall panel on the eastern side of the room, and confirm that the work done was solid. Then she noticed the door. It was set into the wall beside the bar. Unobtrusive, the kind of door that reads as utilitarian in a working restaurant, staff access, or storage. She had noted it in her original survey and marked it as non-structural, irrelevant to the renovation scope. What she had not noted, because it had not been relevant until this moment, was that it was slightly ajar. And from behind it came the low, controlled sound of voices. Bexo was still on his phone. She was not thinking clearly. This was the only explanation she would ever be able to offer, and she would offer it to herself many times in the weeks that followed. She was thinking about invoices and absent clients, and the list on her kitchen table with a crossed-out sixth item, and her hand reached for the door with the automatic intention of closing it properly, because an improperly closed door in a renovation space was a practical concern, and practical concerns were what she had instead of. She opened it. The room on the other side was not storage. It was occupied. 4 men at a table, documents between them, the specific atmosphere of an interrupted meeting pressing against her like a physical thing. She registered all of it in less than a second, and then her brain, that reliable instrument of survival, went completely offline and rebooted in safe mode. She looked at the man at the head of a table. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, completely still, and performed in approximately 3 seconds the most thorough assessment she had ever been subjected to, not invasive, not threatening, but absolute. The kind of attention that misses nothing and decides everything. She said the only thing available to her. "I'm the decorator." Nobody moved. The man at the head of the table held her gaze for 1 additional second. Then, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already determined the correct response before she had finished her sentence, "Close the door," he said. She did. From the inside. Later, much later, after the corridor and the envelope and the drive home, and the 2 hours sitting at her kitchen table staring at a business card that had no title on it, just a name and a number, she would understand that closing the door from the inside was the decision that changed everything. At the time, she thought she was simply following an instruction. She had no idea she was placing herself into a picture someone else had been assembling for 6 weeks. She had no idea the man at the head of the table already knew her name. She had no idea about any of it. She was, in that moment, exactly what she had always been, a woman handling something alone, in a room she hadn't planned to enter, with a folder of invoices and no 6th item on her list. The folder, at least, would be resolved by morning. Everything else was just beginning. Some people walk into the wrong room and walk back out. Others close the door from the inside and change everything. If you've ever made a split-second decision that rewrote your entire life, drop it in the comments. And if you're already sensing that Ryujin knew exactly what he was doing, hit like. Only people siding with Oswoo won't subscribe. The envelope contained exactly what she needed and nothing she had asked for. Min-jae sat in her car in the restaurant parking lot and opened it with the careful deliberateness of someone defusing something, slowly, with full attention, prepared for whatever was inside to be worse than the outside suggested. The outside suggested a great deal. A cream envelope, no markings, handed to her by a man who had appeared in the corridor exactly 30 seconds after she had been told to wait outside, as though the instruction and its execution had been prepared in advance, and she was simply the last variable to arrive. Inside was a document. Single page. The payment extension she had come to negotiate. Not an offer of extension, not a proposed arrangement requiring countersignature and good faith and the slow machinery of negotiation that she had mentally prepared herself for on the drive over. A confirmation. Terms already decided. The outstanding contractor invoices covered from an account she didn't recognize, effective immediately, with a repayment structure so precisely calibrated to her business's actual cash flow that it could only have been constructed by someone who had looked at her books. She read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time because the first 2 readings kept producing the same conclusion, and she wanted a different one. At the bottom, no signature. No company name. Just a business card, slipped between the document and the envelope's inner fold like a footnote. Thick cardstock, the kind that costs more per sheet than her monthly coffee budget, which she had recently reduced to an amount that made her feel personally targeted by economic circumstance.
A name.
A number. Nothing else. Ryujin. She looked at the name for a long time.
She was not naive.
She had grown up in a district where certain names operated as weather systems. You didn't need to understand their mechanics to know when one was approaching. You simply adjusted your behavior accordingly and hoped the adjustment was sufficient. She had never been close enough to that world to have specific knowledge of specific names. But she had the instincts of a woman who had spent her life reading rooms, and the room she had just accidentally entered communicated its nature as clearly as a room could communicate anything. The money was not a gift. The money was never a gift. She knew this with the same certainty. She knew the false wall panel on the eastern side of the restaurant was structurally unnecessary, not because anyone had told her, but because she understood how things were built and what made them load-bearing and what was decorative and what was something else entirely. She should leave the money. Return it. Send a politely worded message that established distance with professional courtesy and maintained enough respect to avoid being impolite to someone it was unwise to be impolite to, while making clear that she was a separate entity who had wandered into a situation she had no stake in and intended to keep it that way. She looked at the repayment document again, at the numbers, at the cash flow calculation that was so accurate it implied access to information she had not voluntarily provided. She called the number. He answered before the second ring had completed, which told her he had been expecting the call, which told her he had known she would make it, which told her something about how he processed people that she immediately filed away as important.
The money, she said,
is yours. His voice was lower than she remembered from the brief, pressurized exchange in the doorway, or rather, she was hearing it properly now, without the interference of shock. It was the voice of a man who spoke quietly because he had never needed volume to be heard.
I didn't ask for it, she said.
You came to ask for time, he said. The problem was the same. The solution was faster. That's not how this works. How does it work? She opened her mouth.
Closed it.
The parking lot was very dark, the restaurant's exterior lights casting long shadows across empty spaces, the city moving distantly beyond the lot's perimeter with complete indifference to the fact that Min Jae-yoon was sitting in her car having the most consequential phone call of her life about a payment extension. What does this cost? She said. The pause that followed had texture. Not hesitation. She was already learning that Ryujin did not hesitate. He simply allocated silence with the same precision he apparently allocated everything else. Nothing, he said. That's not an answer. It's an accurate one. People in your position don't spend money on nothing, she said. I was in that room. I know what kind of meeting I interrupted. I'm not operating under the impression that this is charity. Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, something had shifted almost imperceptibly, not warmth, not softness, but a fractional reduction in the managed distance of his voice, like a door opened 1 inch rather than remaining completely closed. Have dinner with me, he said. The parking lot was very quiet. She looked at the document in her lap, at the numbers that represented 3 months of breathing room, of contractors paid, of her business surviving to complete a project that had already nearly destroyed it. She looked at the business card with its single name and single number and complete absence of explanation. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't.
She should have said no.
Every calibrated instinct she possessed, and she had excellent instincts. She had simply spent so many years handling everything alone that she had trained herself to override them when they produced answers that required help from other people, said no clearly, firmly, without ambiguity. The instincts had also, she noted, told her to close the door from the inside. She was beginning to question their reliability. I need to know one thing first, she said. He waited. She had the impression of a man who could wait indefinitely without it costing him anything, which was either a skill or a condition, and she wasn't yet positioned to determine which. The account that covered those invoices, she said carefully. I need to know it has nothing to do with Oswoo. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. fractionally longer, with a quality she couldn't name but recognized the way you recognize the air pressure change before weather arrives. Something moved in it that she couldn't see. "Why do you ask about Oswa specifically?" he said. "Because he's the one who disappeared and left me holding this situation," she said. "And I want to know if the solution to my problem and the cause of my problem are connected." Another pause. "They are not the same account," he said. She noted that this was not the same as saying they were unconnected. She noted this carefully, filed it, and decided that pursuing it further on a parking lot phone call at 9:45 in the evening was not the correct context. "When?" she said. "Friday. 8 o'clock. A pause. "I'll send the address." "I'll find it myself," she said. The silence that followed felt different from all the previous ones. Shorter, lighter, carrying something she couldn't categorize but which felt, unexpectedly, and without her permission, like the beginning of something that understood her.
"Friday," he said.
And hung up. Min-jae sat in the dark parking lot for another 12 minutes. She looked at the document, looked at the card, looked at her own hands in her lap, steady and practical, the hands of a woman who had been solving problems alone for so long that being offered a solution felt more alarming than the problem itself. Then she started the car, drove home, and sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning with a business card in front of her and the crossed-out 6th item on her list: ask someone for help, staring back at her like a question she had finally, accidentally, without planning or permission, answered. She had not asked. Someone had offered anyway. She was not sure yet whether that was better or worse. She suspected, with the quiet dread of a woman who understood load-bearing things, that it was both. She didn't ask for help. He offered it anyway, and nothing about that was accidental. If you think Min-jae should have returned the money, drop it in the comments. Like and subscribe, because Chapter 3 is where the real architecture of the story starts showing. Only people siding with Oswoo won't. Friday arrived the way dangerous things always arrived in Minji's experience. Quietly, without fanfare, wearing the completely ordinary face of a day that had no intention of behaving like one. She found the address herself. This had required more effort than she anticipated, because the address Ryujin had texted, one line, no context, no restaurant name, just a street and a number, corresponded to a building that did not appear in any standard search result with the cheerful accessibility of a normal dining establishment. No reviews. No photographs. No enthusiastic tourist blog posts about the tasting menu. Just a building on a quiet street in a district that was expensive in the way that old money is expensive, not loudly, not decoratively, but structurally in the bones of it, in the particular silence of streets that have been maintained rather than developed. She stood outside it for 2 minutes before going in. Not from fear. Min-jae did not experience fear the way most people experienced it, as a sharp, immediate thing with a clear object. She experienced it as a low, constant background frequency that she had learned to function alongside, the way people who live near train tracks learn to sleep through the noise. What she experienced outside the building was something more specific. A reckoning. The kind that arrives when a person who has spent their life in complete control of their own decisions stands at a threshold and understands, with full clarity, that crossing it means something they cannot unmean. She crossed it. Inside, a man she had never seen before materialized from a position near the entrance, not aggressively, not theatrically, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who had been waiting for her specifically and had prepared accordingly. He led her to a room on the 2nd floor without speaking, which she appreciated because she had nothing to say, and small talk in these circumstances would have been an insult to both of them. The room was private. 6 tables, only one occupied. The lighting was low and warm, and the kind of deliberately considered that meant someone had thought carefully about what this room was for and had designed accordingly. There were no flowers. The table held 2 glasses of water, already poured, and a menu that had prices on it. She checked immediately, with the practical reflex of someone for whom numbers were never decorative, and breathed once, quietly, when the prices confirmed she was in a place that was expensive, but not aggressively so. Not a power move. A consideration. She filed this. Ryujin was already seated. He stood when she entered, and she had the immediate, disorienting experience of seeing someone in full context for the first time, In the doorway, in the pressurized seconds of the accidental meeting, she had registered presence and stillness and the quality of his attention. Here, across a properly lit room, she registered the rest. He was taller than she remembered. Younger than the weight of him suggested, mid-30s, perhaps, with the kind of face that had arrived at its final form early and intended to stay there. Dark suit, no tie. The same complete absence of performance that she had noticed in the restaurant doorway, which meant it was not a strategy. It was simply how he occupied space. She sat down.
He sat down.
"You found it," he said. "I said I would. Most people ask for help with directions." "I'm not most people," she said, and picked up the menu and felt his attention settle on her with the same quality it had carried in the doorway, complete, unhurried, missing nothing. The first 20 minutes were not what she had prepared for. She had prepared for a man who talked about himself, who used the architecture of a dinner to establish territory, to demonstrate influence, to make clear through careful implication what kind of world she was being invited to consider. She had prepared, in other words, for the performance that power usually felt obligated to deliver to people it was trying to impress. Ryujin did not perform. He asked about the restaurant project. Specifically, not with the polite generality of someone making conversation, but with the precise curiosity of someone who had already read the file and wanted the parts that weren't in it. He asked about her original survey, the false wall panel, the structural decisions she had made, and why. He listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man for whom listening was not passive but active, a skill, practiced and intentional, the kind that made the person being listened to feel, uncomfortably and without warning, that they were being understood rather than simply heard. She was not prepared for this. She talked about the project for 12 minutes before she caught herself and stopped. "You asked about the wall panel specifically," she said. "Yes."
Why?
He looked at her with his still, dark eyes that had performed their complete assessment in the restaurant doorway and arrived at conclusions she still couldn't read. "Because you identified it as structurally unnecessary in your original survey," he said. "And then built it anyway because the client requested it. I wanted to know if you questioned it." "I questioned it," she said. "I built it professionally." "Why didn't you refuse?" "Because clients request things I disagree with regularly," she said. "My job is to execute their vision competently, not to substitute my judgment for theirs on aesthetic decisions." "Even when the decision is wrong?" "Wrong aesthetically," she said carefully. "Not wrong structurally. It didn't compromise the building." She paused. "Why does this matter to you?" He held her gaze. "Because the panel matters," he said. "For reasons that aren't aesthetic." The table was quiet. Outside the room, the restaurant produced its low ambient sounds, service, distant conversation, the ordinary music of a functioning space. Inside, Minjae sat with the specific stillness of a woman whose pattern recognition was firing on every available frequency. "Aswa had you build it," she said slowly. "Yes. And it contains something." A pause. Not confirmation. Not denial. The particular quality of silence that operates as both. "You're not going to tell me what," she said. "Not tonight. But you're going to tell me eventually." He looked at her for a long moment. The almost expression she was beginning to identify, not a smile, something more contained, the suggestion of a response that hadn't fully decided to surface, moved briefly across his face and disappeared. "You closed the door from the inside," he said. She blinked. "What?" "In the restaurant. I told you to close the door. You closed it from the inside." He looked at her steadily. "That told me something about you." "What did it tell you?" "That you don't retreat," he said. "When faced with something unknown, you contain it. You stay in the room. You assess from the inside rather than the outside." A pause. Most people would have closed it from the outside and left. She looked at him, at the composed, precise face of a man who had apparently made significant decisions about her based on a reflexive action she hadn't consciously chosen. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't a strategy, that she had simply been following an instruction without fully processing the geometry of it. She didn't tell him this, because it was true, and because the truth felt in this particular moment like a thing that would give him more rather than less. "The panel," she said instead. "Whatever is in it, Does it put me in danger? He considered this with the unhurried honesty of a man who did not deliver comfortable lies when accurate ones were available. It did, he said, before Friday. And now? Now it's managed. By you. Yes. She picked up her water glass, set it down, looked at the table and then at him, and then at the room they were sitting in, which was warm and quiet and completely removed from the ordinary Friday evening operating beyond its walls. You need something from me, she said. Not dinner. Something specific. Something that requires me to be cooperative. He didn't deny it. What? She said. Your access to the building, he said. Your professional presence there is legitimate and unremarkable. You can move through that space without attracting attention that other kinds of presence would attract. He held her gaze. I need the panel accessed by someone who has a credible reason to be near it. The room was very quiet. You want me to finish the renovation, she said. Yes. And access the panel. Yes. In exchange for the invoice coverage. No, he said. And the directness of it, clean, unhedged, made her look at him sharply. The invoice coverage was separate. It had no conditions. This is a separate request. You can refuse it. She looked at him for a long time. And if I refuse, she said, you finish the renovation on your own terms. The payment arrangement stands. We don't speak again. She absorbed this. The dinner that had no performance in it. The listening that felt like being understood. The wall panel and the covered invoices and the name in the file and the 6 weeks she didn't know about yet. The door she had closed from the inside. I need to know what's in the panel, she said. I know, he said. Before I agree to anything. I know that too, he said. And then, with the quiet precision of a man who had decided exactly how much of the truth this moment required, come back Saturday. I'll show you. She should have asked for more. Should have established terms, conditions, the careful boundaries of a woman who understood that she was being asked to do something in a world she did not belong to. Instead, she said, I'll find the address myself. And for the second time in a week, she watched something move briefly across his composed, precise face, something that wasn't quite a smile, wasn't quite relief, but carried the quality of both and the weight of neither. She was collecting these moments without meaning to. She suspected, with the quiet certainty of a woman who understood load-bearing things, that this was exactly what he had intended. She could have walked away. She could have taken the money and kept her distance and let the panel stay exactly where it was. But Min Jae-yoon doesn't retreat, and now she's agreed to go back. If you think she should have refused, tell us in the comments. Like and subscribe, because Saturday's reveal changes everything. Only people siding with Oswoo won't hit that button. The thing about Oswoo was that he had been, by all visible measures, a perfectly unremarkable man. This was Min Jae would come to understand the most dangerous kind. He was 51, moderately successful in the way that conceals rather than announces itself, and possessed of the specific social talent for occupying spaces without leaving impressions, the kind of man you meet at a function and describe afterward as the one in the gray suit because nothing more specific had registered. He had hired Min Jae through a referral chain long enough that by the time his name reached her desk it had passed through 3 intermediaries and arrived wearing the credibility of other people's endorsements, like a borrowed coat. She had not questioned it. This was the part she kept returning to, sitting at her kitchen table on Friday night after the dinner, long after she should have been sleeping, with the cold coffee and the spreadsheets and the specific insomnia of a woman whose pattern recognition had spent the evening firing on every available frequency and was now refusing to stand down. She had not questioned the referral, had not questioned the budget irregularities she had noticed in the second month and attributed to a client who was disorganized rather than deliberately obscure. Had not questioned the false wall panel with its structurally unnecessary bulk and its very specific dimensions, which she now understood, with the retrospective clarity that arrives only after someone has handed you the correct lens, had been specified by Oswoo with a precision that decorative requests did not usually require. She had been, she understood now, selected for her professional competence and her financial vulnerability and her habit of handling everything alone. She was the clean layer. The legitimate paper trail. the decorator, whose invoices made everything around her harder to trace. She had been used. This produced in her not the sharp, hot emotion of someone who has been betrayed, but something colder and more structural. The feeling of a person who has identified a load-bearing error in something they built and must now reckon with both the error and its implications simultaneously. She was angry. But the anger was the organized kind, the kind that doesn't dissipate into feeling but converts directly into purpose. Saturday arrived. She found the address herself. This one was different from Friday's restaurant, not a dining establishment, not a space designed for managed conversations over visible price menus. It was an office building in a district that announced nothing about itself. 12 floors of clean glass and neutral facade that could have housed a law firm or an accounting practice or any number of legitimate enterprises, and in fact, Min-jae suspected, housed several. The kind of building that was so deliberately unremarkable, it had clearly been designed by someone who understood that the most effective concealment is indistinguishability. The same man from Friday materialized at the entrance, led her to the 8th floor without speaking. She was beginning to appreciate his consistency. The office was clean and spare and looked, at first assessment, like a workspace rather than a statement, which distinguished it immediately from every powerful man's office she had ever seen, because powerful men's offices were almost universally statements. Large desks, significant art, the careful arrangement of objects that communicated net worth and influence to anyone who entered. This room had a desk, a table, 2 chairs, and walls of windows looking out over the district with the particular clarity of a high floor on a cold morning. Ryujin was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when she came in and looked at her with the complete, unhurried attention she was accumulating experience with, and she noticed, as she had noticed at the restaurant, as she kept noticing despite her intentions, that being the object of that attention felt different from being looked at. It felt like being accurately perceived, which was either a gift or a vulnerability, and she had not yet determined which. Saturday, he said. I said I'd come, she replied. He gestured to the table. On it was a folder, not thick, not dramatic, just a standard folder with the contained weight of something that had been assembled with care. She sat. He sat across from her. Aswoo, he said, has been moving money through legitimate renovation projects for 4 years. She opened the folder. The documents inside were organized with the same precision as everything else associated with Ryujin: clean, sequential, annotated where annotation was necessary, and nowhere else. Financial records. Property transactions. A series of renovation contracts with different contractors across 3 districts, each one structured identically to hers. Clean invoices, legitimate paper trail, a real professional doing real work. She was the 5th. She looked up from the documents.
For years, she said.
Yes. And nobody stopped it. The 2 days passed with the specific crawling slowness of time measured in anxiety rather than hours. Min-jae returned to her regular life. Client calls, invoices, the skincare brief she had been neglecting for a woman who wanted her brand to feel simultaneously premium and accessible, which was less a creative direction and more a request for a personality transplant, and moved through all of it with the surface competence of someone whose professional functioning was entirely independent of whatever was happening underneath it. She had developed this skill young. The ability to perform normalcy while processing something else entirely, the way a building can look structurally sound from the street while something fundamental shifts in its foundation. She told nobody. This was not a decision so much as a default. The 6th item, crossed out twice, was not crossed out because she had overcome it, but because she hadn't. She had agreed to Ryujin's request, negotiated her conditions, extracted his written confirmation, and carried all of it back to her apartment alone, where it sat in a folder on her kitchen table alongside the original invoice documents and the business card she still hadn't put away. Her closest friend was a woman named Chan, an emergency room nurse with a specific brand of dark humor that develops in people who spend their professional lives managing crisis and need somewhere to put the overflow. Chan had known Min-jae for 11 years and had developed, over those 11 years, a finely calibrated sensor for the particular frequency Min-jae broadcast when she was handling something she wasn't talking about. She called on Sunday evening. What's happening? She said. Not a question. Nothing, Min-jae said, which was so transparently false that she heard Chan make the specific sound, half exhale, half managed restraint, of a woman who had heard this particular nothing before and knew exactly what category of something it contained. Are you in trouble? No, are you about to be? A pause. Min-jae. I have a situation, she said, that I'm managing. Alone. Chan, I'm not arguing, Chan said, with the surgical precision of a woman who had learned that arguing with Minji's self-sufficiency was less effective than simply documenting it for later. I'm noting, for the record, that you are managing a situation alone. Again. And that when it becomes unmanageable, because they always become unmanageable, I will be here, and I will not say I told you so, and you'll be grateful. I know, Min-jae said. Tell me one thing, Chan said. Is it a person? The pause was longer than Min-jae intended. Interesting, Chan said quietly and hung up. Min-jae looked at the phone for a moment. Filed the conversation in the same place she was filing everything else that didn't have a category yet, and went back to the brief about the brand that wanted to be premium and accessible simultaneously. She returned to the restaurant on Monday. The cover was legitimate, a scheduled site check, documented in her project management system, texted to the building manager 2 days in advance with the professional courtesy of a contractor who maintained clean records because clean records were the only armor a solo operator possessed. She arrived at 10 in the morning with her survey equipment and her project folder and the specific internal stillness of a woman who had decided something and was now simply executing it. The building was quiet. Monday morning, renovation pause, the contractors not due back until Wednesday. Just Min-jae and the half-finished space and the low gray light coming through windows that hadn't been cleaned since the project began. She worked her way through the front rooms first, methodically, documenting the completed work, noting what remained, building the professional paper trail of a site visit that had exactly one purpose she was not documenting.
She took her time.
An hour in the front rooms. Another 30 minutes on the structural elements along the northern wall. Then she moved to the eastern side. The panel was exactly as she had left it, built to Oswa's specifications, professionally finished, indistinguishable from the surrounding wall to anyone who hadn't built it. She knew every seam, every fastening point. The precise location of the access she had incorporated into the design at Oswa's instruction, framed as a maintenance access for the electrical routing, which she had questioned briefly and then built because the client had requested it and the client had been paying. She photographed the panel, added the photographs to her project documentation. Noted in her site report that the panel required final finishing work on the upper seam, which was true, which gave her a professional reason to be in close contact with it for as long as she needed. Then she accessed it. The cavity was exactly as the diagram had shown, precisely dimensioned. Inside, wrapped in plain document sleeves, was a collection of files that represented 4 years of careful architecture. Financial records, transaction logs, correspondence, the paper skeleton of a money laundering operation constructed by a man in a gray suit who had understood that the most effective concealment is indistinguishability. She photographed everything before removing it, documented the cavity's existence, its dimensions, its relationship to the panel specifications Oswo had provided. Built the evidentiary record of a contractor who had identified a structural discrepancy and was documenting its contents professionally. Then she put the documents in her project bag, resealed the panel, and continued her site inspection. She was at the front door, bag over her shoulder, pulling on her coat with the unhurried efficiency of a woman finishing a routine Monday morning site visit, when the building's exterior door opened. She looked up. The man who entered was not someone she recognized. Mid-40s, compact, wearing the particular expression of someone who had come to a location expecting to find it empty and was recalculating rapidly upon finding it occupied. His eyes went to her bag, then to her face, then to her bag again. She knew immediately. The way you know structural failure before you see it, in the air pressure, the quality of the silence, the specific stillness of something about to give way. You're the decorator, he said. His voice was flat. Not a greeting. An assessment. Site inspection, she said, and held up her project folder with the calm confidence of a woman who had been managing difficult situations alone since she was 9 years old and had no intention of stopping now. He looked at the folder, looked at her, made the calculation that she could see him making. The contractor with the legitimate documentation, the professional presence, the unremarkable Monday morning site visit. Oswa sent me to check on the progress, he said. Mr. Oswa hasn't been available, she said pleasantly. I've been proceeding on the original specifications. The report will be filed by end of day. A pause. The man's eyes moved to her bag one more time. What's in the bag, he said. Survey equipment, she said. Documentation. I can provide copies of the site report if Mr. Oswa's office needs them. She said this with the specific professional pleasantness of a woman who had nothing to hide, which was the performance of her life, delivered over a bag containing 4 years of evidence that she was holding with the steady hands she had. The documents took 3 days to process. Min-jae knew this because Ryujin told her, which meant he was telling her things now. Operational things, timeline things, the kind of information that people inside a situation receive and people outside it don't. She noted the shift without commenting on it, the way she noted structural changes in buildings, quietly, precisely, with full awareness of what the change implied about the load being carried. She spent those 3 days at her kitchen table. Not in crisis. Not in the managed panic of a woman waiting for consequences she couldn't control. She worked the premium accessible skincare brief, 2 new project proposals, the final documentation for the restaurant renovation that she was completing on her own terms, her name on it, exactly as Ryujin had confirmed. She built her professional paper trail with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything, and in the spaces between work, she sat with the accumulated weight of the past 2 weeks and tried to construct an honest inventory of where she was. The inventory was complicated. She was in possession of knowledge she hadn't sought about, a world she hadn't chosen to enter. She had retrieved documents from a wall she had built without knowing what she was building. She had walked past a man who worked for Oswu with a bag full of evidence and a professional smile and hands that hadn't shaken until she was outside and around the corner. She had gotten into a car that arrived in 90 seconds because someone had been tracking her location closely enough to have it positioned and ready. She had not asked how the car knew where she was. This was the part she kept returning to. Not with fear. The low background frequency of it was present as always, managed as always, but with the specific attention of a woman who understood load-bearing things and had identified something in the structure of her current situation that required honest examination. Ryujin had resources she couldn't fully see. Operated with information she wasn't always given context for. Had known her name, her business, her financial situation, and the specific contents of a wall she had built before she knew any of this about him. She was inside a situation that he had architected from the outside, and the fact that he had been transparent about this, had told her, through carefully chosen honesty, more than he was obligated to tell her, did not change its fundamental geometry. She understood, choosing to trust someone whose full picture she couldn't see. This was new. This was, in the specific vocabulary of Min Jae-yoon's interior life, almost unprecedented. She called Cheon on Wednesday evening. It's a person, she said, without preamble. A pause. The sound of a hospital corridor in the background, distant and institutional. Tell me, Cheon said. She told her. Not everything. There were parts that belonged to a world Cheon didn't need to be adjacent to, and Minji's protectiveness of the people she loved was the one area where her self-sufficiency extended outward rather than inward. But enough. The restaurant.
The door.
The documents. The car that arrived in 90 seconds and the coffee that was the wrong order, and the way he listened with the specific attention of someone for whom listening was a practice skill rather than a courtesy. Cheon was quiet for a moment when she finished. You trust him, she said. I'm assessing whether I should. That's not what I said. Min-jae looked at her kitchen table. At the folder and the business card she still hadn't put away, and the cold coffee she was on her 3rd cup of, which was 2 cups more than her nutritionist had recently suggested with the careful diplomacy of a professional delivering unpopular information.
He was honest with me, she said.
When he didn't have to be. People are honest, Cheon said, when the honesty serves them. I know. And sometimes, Chan said, with a particular precision of a woman who had spent 11 years watching Min Jae construct reasons to remain self-contained, they're honest because they've decided you're worth being honest with. Those aren't the same thing, but they're also not mutually exclusive. A pause. Which one feels true? Min Jae sat with this. Both, she said finally. Then you're paying attention, Chan said.
Good.
The hospital corridor noise shifted. I have to go. Someone is bleeding. A pause. Call me when it develops. It's not. It's already developing, Chan said. You called me. You don't call me about things that aren't developing. And hung up. Min Jae looked at the phone for a moment, filed the conversation, went back to the skincare brief. Ryujin called Thursday morning. Not Taesung, a detail she registered immediately with the pattern recognition of a woman who noticed things before she had context for why they mattered. Ryujin himself, on the direct number, at 8:47 in the morning. The documents are verified, he said. All of them. All relevant materials. The financial records are complete. The transaction logs cover the full 4-year period. A pause. The case closes. She absorbed this. 4 years of evidence, retrieved from a wall she had built, now doing the work it had apparently been waiting to do. There was something in this, some quality of resolution that felt larger than the specific situation, like the satisfaction of a structural problem correctly diagnosed and properly addressed. The other 4 contractors, she said. Protected, he said. As agreed. The documentation establishes their work as legitimate, which it was, and their participation as unwitting, which it also was. A pause. Your survey documentation was particularly useful. Your independent identification of the panel as structurally unnecessary established the discrepancy before anyone asked you to notice it. I noticed it because it was wrong, she said. Yes, he said. And something in the word, simple, direct, carrying the specific quality of a man acknowledging something he found genuinely significant, settled over the conversation with the weight of things that don't need elaboration. She was quiet for a moment. Is it over? She said. A pause. The kind that had texture. Mostly, he said. What does mostly mean? The residence was not what she expected. This had become, she realized, a pattern with Ryujin, the consistent failure of her expectations to accurately predict his reality. She had expected the home of a man in his position to communicate power the way his world communicated everything else, through weight, through deliberate architecture, through the careful arrangement of space designed to remind visitors of their relative insignificance. She had expected something that felt like an office building with better furniture. Instead, it was a house. Not small, it was large in the unassuming way that genuine wealth is large, with space that existed because it was needed rather than to make a statement about its existence. But it had the quality of a place that was lived in rather than maintained, which distinguished it from every powerful man's residence she had constructed in her imagination on the 40-minute drive over. Books on actual shelves in actual disorder. A kitchen that looked used. Windows without treatment, letting in the gray soul morning without apology. She stood in the entrance and looked at it and revised, quietly and completely, the remaining architecture of her assumptions about him. He was in the main room when she entered, not waiting theatrically, not positioned to receive her with the managed formality of a man staging a first impression, but standing at the window with coffee, in the middle of what appeared to be an interrupted morning, which meant she was being incorporated into his actual life rather than a curated version of it. He turned when she came in, looked at her bag, at her face, at whatever was visible in her expression that she wasn't monitoring.
Coffee, he said.
I'll get the order right this time. She set her bag down. Milk, she said. 1 sugar. Noted, he said, and went to the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of a man performing a domestic task, which was, she thought, one of the stranger things she had witnessed in the past 2 weeks, and the past 2 weeks had contained significant competition for that category. She looked around the room. At the books, she crossed to the nearest shelf with the automatic interest of someone for whom other people's reading habits were a primary diagnostic tool. The collection was unsurprising in its range and completely surprising in its specificity. Architecture. Structural engineering. 3 shelves of novels, the kind about ordinary people surviving extraordinary circumstances, which she remembered him mentioning at the Friday dinner with the quiet aside that he found them instructive. Korean history. 2 shelves of legal documentation she didn't examine closely for reasons of deliberate self-preservation. And on the bottom shelf, worn in a way that indicated frequency of use rather than age, a collection of books about cities. Not architectural surveys, books about how cities worked, how they held together, what made them function at the level below the visible, in the infrastructure and the systems and the load-bearing elements that nobody saw until they failed. She was still looking at them when he returned with the coffee. She took it, lifted the lid. Milk. 1 sugar. She looked at him. I asked Taesung, he said, with the complete absence of self-consciousness of a man who had wanted accurate information and obtained it through the most direct available method. She sat down. He sat across from her. And then, without the architecture of a managed conversation or the careful pacing of a meeting with an agenda, just 2 people in a lived-in room on a gray Thursday morning, he told her the rest. The partner at the top of the chain was a man named Gilsoo, 62. 14 years in legitimate finance, the last 8 spent constructing a secondary architecture beneath it that had made Oswa's operation look like a rough draft. He had insulated himself with the specific expertise of someone who understood that the most effective concealment is not hiding but complexity, so many layers between himself and the visible activity that each layer read as legitimate, and the whole could only be understood from above. Ryujin had been building toward Gilsoo for 2 years. The documents from the panel were the last piece. 2 years, Min-jae said. Yes. And Oswa was 1 layer, he said. The one closest to the visible surface. Useful for evidence, not sufficient for the case. He held her gaze. The documents you retrieved contain transaction records that connect Gilsoo's accounts directly to the routing. For years of it. Dated, annotated, complete. What happens now? She said. It's already happening, he said. The materials were delivered yesterday to people with the authority and the motivation to use them correctly. A pause. Gilsoo will be aware of this within 48 hours. Possibly sooner. And the reaction you mentioned, she said. The one that required me to be somewhere safe. He was quiet for a moment. Gilsoo has people, he said, who will be deployed to identify and address the source of the leak before the case can be formalized. Standard procedure for a man in his position facing exposure. He looked at her directly. You are, on paper, the most visible person connected to the panel. Because of my professional documentation, she said. Yes. The same documentation that protects you legally creates visibility. A pause. I miscalculated this. I prioritized the evidentiary value of your survey records without fully accounting for the exposure they created. He held her gaze with the specific quality of a man delivering an honest accounting of his own error, which she recognized as rare and received accordingly. I'm sorry. She looked at him. At the composed face that was, she had learned, not the absence of interior life, but its containment, the disciplined surface of someone who had trained themselves to process everything internally rather than broadcast it, which was, she thought, not entirely unlike a certain freelance contractor she could name. How long until it's resolved, she said. Gilsoo will be in custody within 72 hours, he said. The case is complete. The materials are placed. The machinery is moving. A pause. After that, there is no remaining reason for anyone to look at you. 72 hours, she said. Yes. She nodded once, picked up her coffee, looked at the window and the gray city beyond it and thought, with the organized clarity of a woman who had been processing difficult information in cold kitchens since she was 9 years old, that 72 hours was a specific and manageable duration. She had worked with worse timelines on renovation projects with less cooperative clients. Show me the books, she said. He looked at her. The city ones, she said. On the bottom shelf. I want to know which one you've read most. A pause. The almost expression, closer to the surface than usual, less contained, the fractional openings she had been cataloging across 2 weeks of careful attention, arrived and this time did not immediately disappear. He stood, crossed to the shelf. pulled out a book with the worn spine and the specific handling of something consulted rather than displayed. Handed it to her. She looked at the cover. An urban infrastructure study, Seoul's subterranean systems, the pipes and cables and foundational architecture that held the visible city up. Load-bearing things, she said. Yes, he said quietly. She set the book on the table between them. The 72 hours passed. Not dramatically. Not with the cinematic compression of a crisis resolving itself in a single urgent sequence, but with a gradual, unglamorous, deeply human texture of time spent in close proximity to someone you are still learning. Min-jae worked from the residence, her laptop, her project files, the premium accessible skincare brief that she finally resolved at 11 on Friday morning with a solution so elegant that she felt briefly and privately triumphant in the way that only good work produces. Ryujin moved through his days with the same economy she had observed in every other context, calls taken in the office at the end of the hall, meetings conducted remotely, the occasional departure and return managed with a quietness that told her the situation outside was moving without requiring her to witness its mechanics. They ate dinner together on Thursday evening. Friday morning, she found coffee on the kitchen counter before she reached the machine. Milk, 1 sugar, still warm, which meant he had timed it to her movement through the apartment with the specific attention of a man who noticed things and acted on what he noticed without announcing it. She stood with the coffee and looked at the kitchen, at the used surfaces and the window without treatment and the evidence of a life that was larger and more complicated than its inhabitants' composure suggested, and felt something clarify in her that had been approaching clarity for 2 weeks. She found him in the main room.
Gilsu, she said.
In custody as of an hour ago, he said. The case is formalized. The exposure is closed. She nodded.
You can go home, he said.
And something in the way he said it, careful, unassuming, containing no assumption about what came next, told her he was giving her the exit cleanly and without condition, the way he had offered the initial payment extension without conditions, the way he had confirmed her terms in writing without negotiation, the way he had been, across the entire complicated architecture of the past 2 weeks, consistently and precisely honest in the specific direction of her freedom rather than her obligation. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I'm not going yet. He was still. I have a question, she said. A final one. He waited with the patience she had come to understand was not performance, but character. The deep, structural patience of a man who had learned that the things worth waiting for required it. The file, she said. The one you kept for 6 weeks before I walked through that door. What was in it besides the professional details? He held her gaze. Nothing, he said. For the first 4 weeks. She absorbed this. And after 4 weeks? A pause. The longest one she had ever waited through. Longer than the parking lot. Longer than the 8th floor office. Longer than the Thursday morning when he had told her about Gilsu and apologized for the miscalculation with the clean honesty of someone who kept no separate account for his own errors. I started noting things that weren't in the professional documentation, he said. The survey observations. The way you documented discrepancies before you had context for them. The payment extension request you made in person rather than by email because you wanted to read the room. He looked at her steadily. Small things. Specific things. A pause. The kind of things you note when you're paying a different kind of attention. She looked at him. At the composed, precise, load-bearing face of a man who had just, with complete and undefended honesty, told her that she had become something other than a file to him before she had ever walked through his door. You should have told me earlier, she said. I know, he said. No justification. No scaffolding. Just the clean acknowledgement of someone who made accurate assessments of their own errors and expected no particular credit for the honesty. She crossed the room. Sat beside him on the couch rather than across from him, which was a small logistical adjustment that carried, in the specific vocabulary of 2 people who noticed things and acted on what they noticed, the weight of a significant structural decision. He looked at her. The almost expression arrived, and this time completed itself, fully, without containment, the real thing rather than the managed suggestion of it, and it changed his face the way she had first seen it change at the Friday dinner when he had laughed at the relocated journalist. Younger, less constructed. Entirely briefly, undisguised. I have a renovation to finish, she said. I know. And approximately 4 outstanding project proposals that need responses. I know. And a client who wants her brand to feel premium and accessible simultaneously, which I've resolved, but she doesn't know yet. Congratulations, he said, and the word was dry and warm and completely genuine in the specific way of someone who understood the satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. She looked at the city through the untreated windows. Gray and cold and enormous and indifferent, moving through its Friday afternoon with the steady persistence of a system that had been load-bearing for longer than anyone currently in it could remember. I'm going to keep noticing things, she said.
About this.
About you.
About whatever this is.
She turned to look at him directly. And I'm going to say what I notice. Out loud. Without managing it first. I know, he said. That's going to be inconvenient for you sometimes. Probably, he said. And the almost smile, still present, shifted into something that carried the quality of a man who had been managing an enormous and complicated world alone for a very long time and had just identified, with a specific relief of someone finding a structural solution they hadn't known they were looking for, that inconvenient honesty from a person who noticed load-bearing things was not a problem. It was, in fact, exactly what had been missing. She picked up the city book from the table between them, turned it over, set it back down. 1 sugar, she said. He looked at her. If you're going to keep making the coffee, she said. 1 sugar. Not 1.5. A pause. Taesung was approximating, he said. Tell him to be specific next time. I'll tell him myself next time, he said quietly. She looked at him. At the room. At the books and the used kitchen and the windows full of city and the folder on the table that contained, among other things, a list with a 6th item circled twice. She was not in a kitchen at 2 in the morning. She was not handling something alone. She was sitting beside a man who had kept a file for 6 weeks and filled the last 2 with the kind of attention that didn't announce itself but didn't disappear either, and she was choosing, clearly, deliberately, with full awareness of the geometry of it, to stay in the room. Not because the door had closed, because she had closed it herself. And this time she knew exactly what she was doing. 6 months later, Yoon Interiors moved into an office on the 9th floor of a building Min-jae had found herself, negotiated herself, and signed for herself, because some things, she had decided, needed to remain entirely hers, and Ryujin had understood this without being told, which was either the most impressive thing about him or simply the most consistent. The office had good bones. A structural integrity she had identified on the first visit and confirmed on the second. Large windows, north-facing, the kind of light that was honest rather than flattering, the best kind for a person who needed to see things accurately. On the first morning, she arrived at 7:30, unlocked the door, set her bag on the new desk, and looked out the window at the city she had lived in her entire life and was still, in certain lights, still learning. Her phone buzzed. A message from Cheon. Office warming tonight. I'm bringing food. You're not allowed to say you're managing it alone. She was typing back when a second message arrived. From Ryujin. The building on Namdi Monaro, 3rd floor. Structural survey says load-bearing wall on the eastern side is misidentified in the original documentation. Thought you'd want to know. She stared at the message. Then she called him. He answered on the first ring. You're sending me cases now, she said. I'm sending you accurate information, he said. What you do with it is your decision. That's a very fine distinction. You appreciate fine distinctions, he said, and she could hear it, the full laugh, brief and genuine, the one she had been collecting since the Friday dinner and had by now accumulated enough of to understand it was not rare because he didn't feel things but because he only showed them to people he had decided were worth showing. I'll look at the building, she said. I know, he said. And Ryujin. Yes. Next time you find a structural misidentification in someone's documentation, she said, you can tell me about it over coffee. A pause. The good kind. 1 sugar, he said. Not 1.5. She looked out the window at the city, enormous and gray and load-bearing and full of walls that contained things people didn't yet know they had built. She laughed. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, the sound of it in an empty room felt not like loneliness, but like space. Clean, honest, structural space, waiting to be filled with exactly the right things. She had found the address herself. She intended to keep it. Some people spend their whole lives handling everything alone until someone makes it structurally impossible to keep doing that. If this story kept you up, if Minji's silence felt familiar, if Ryujin's patience felt like something you needed to believe in, leave in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that the right person doesn't ask you to need less. They just make needing feel less dangerous. Like, subscribe, and remember, only people siding with Aswoo and Gilsu won't hit that button. Everyone else already knows what to do.